I'm 24 years old, living in Lansing, Michigan, and I always dreamed of becoming an IT expert. I imagined working for a big tech firm, writing code that solved complex problems, maybe even relocating out west to chase new opportunities. But life, as it often does, has a way of derailing our plans. It all started last year when my dad passed away unexpectedly. The shock of losing him hit me hard, but it was nothing compared to what came next. My mom left soon after. She took off without any explanation, leaving behind me and my 8-year-old sister, Carla. I couldn't just let her end up in the foster system or with distant relatives who barely knew us. So I put my IT dreams on hold. Instead, I took up a job delivering pizzas at a local joint called Bellaroma's, just off Cedar Street. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, rent, groceries, and making sure my sister always had enough to eat. Most nights, I work the evening shift, which means I'm out on the road from around 4 p.m. until midnight, sometimes later if it's busy on the weekends. It's not the safest gig, especially in certain neighborhoods after dark. But I never ran into trouble, at least not until last July. It started as just another Thursday evening on July 14th. The muggy Midwestern humidity made the air feel thick and sticky, even after the sun had gone down. It was a kind of night that made you long for a breeze that never came. Orders were coming in steady, nothing unusual. But then, around 9 p.m., we got an order, 2 large pepperoni pizzas and a side of wings. The customer gave an address on a quiet residential street near old downtown Lansing. It was a kind of place with big trees, old houses, and a lack of streetlights that made it feel like time had passed it by. I wrote down the address, loaded up my car, and set off. It was a 10-minute drive, but as I pulled up to the house, something didn't feel right. The place was dark, except for a flickering porch light, the kind of light that just adds to the eerie quiet of the night. I knocked on the door, calling out, "Pizza delivery." No answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. "Pizza delivery." I called out. Finally, a man's voice came from behind the door, low and breathless, like he'd been running or pacing. "Be right there." His voice sounded strained, almost like he was in a hurry or maybe hiding something. I stood there waiting. The silence stretched on, and the hair on the back of my neck began to rise. When the door finally opened, a tall, lean man in a gray sweatshirt appeared. He didn't open the door fully, just enough to slip his hand to the gap and give me a wad of cash. His face was half hidden in shadow, his expression unreadable. He nodded once, grabbed the pizzas and wings, and slammed the door shut without a word. Something was off, but I couldn't quite place it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. There was no thank you, no smile, just an abrupt exchange. I shrugged it off as weird, but nothing to get worked up about. After all, it was just a pizza delivery, right? But then, as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. There was no sound from inside. No TV. No music. Not even the murmur of a conversation. It was dead silent in the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone through the dark windows. As I walked back to my car, I had this uneasy feeling lingering, like something was watching me from the shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But something about that night stuck with me long after I drove away. I could barely make out his face through the narrow gap in the door, but I caught a glimpse of heavy stubble and tired eyes. The weird part was that as soon as he shut the door, I heard him sliding a chain lock or something heavy into place. It was subtle, almost like he didn't want me to notice, but I did. Something about that moment didn't sit right with me. I went back to Bellaroma's, finished my shift, and tried not to think too much about the encounter. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept telling myself it was just a strange one-off interaction. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, Friday, around the same time, another order came through from that exact address. Same items, 2 large pepperoni pizzas, and a side of wings. My co-worker teased me, saying I must have done a great job tonight before they were reordering so soon. I laughed it off, trying to brush off the strange tension that had settled in my chest. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Or maybe they really liked their pizza. But when I arrived at the house, it felt different. It was even darker this time. The porch light was off, and all I could see was a faint glow of a TV through a window. It was barely enough light to see the outline of the house. The silence was oppressive, like the air was thick with something waiting. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, he appeared. He opened the screen door just a crack, glancing at me with his quiet, unsettling intensity. No smile, no small talk. He just handed me the exact amount of cash, took the pizzas and wings, and shut the door. The entire interaction lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like much longer. I stood there, staring at the door after it slammed shut, unsure what had just happened. As I drove back to the restaurant, I felt a gnawing unease deep in my gut. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just one of those private people who didn't like to make small talk. But as I counted my tips that night, something caught my eye. He'd given me an extra $20. It seemed odd for someone who barely spoke a word. I couldn't explain it, but that extra cash left me with a sense of discomfort that wouldn't go away. That weekend, I started noticing something strange. Whenever I was out on deliveries, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I would glance up at my rearview mirror, and for a split second, I'd catch a glimpse of a dark gray hoodie. It would be gone just as quickly as it appeared, but it left a chill in my spine. Other times, I'd spot someone wearing the same hoodie standing near a bus stop or down an alley, and the moment they saw me looking, they'd quickly turn away, disappearing into the shadows. My brain kept telling me it was just random people around town. It could be nothing, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. That voice told me something was wrong, that I was being watched closely. By Monday, July 18th, I had a knot of dread that I couldn't shake. I started my shift as usual at 4 p.m., but the feeling grew heavier as the day went on. Around 10 p.m., the phone rang again. Another order from that same address. At this point, I wasn't even surprised. I was just uncomfortable. The dread in my stomach had become a familiar companion. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should have a co-worker go instead. But we were understaffed that night, and the thought of leaving the order just hanging there made me uneasy. I took the delivery. When I got there, the house was completely dark. No flicker of the TV, no porch light, nothing. The street was dead quiet, the kind of silence that pressing on you like the air itself was thick with waiting. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt it, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to make everything around me feel unreal. The house loomed in front of me, dark and still, like it was holding its breath. I knocked softly at first, hoping for a normal interaction, a quick handoff, maybe a quick word, but no answer. My heart pounded a little harder. I knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Bellaroma's pizza delivery." Nothing, just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees, the rustling leaves, and the eerie quiet of the street. I stood there for a long moment, the darkness pressing in. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, annoyance mixing with growing anxiety. What the hell was going on? I started walking away, but the unease was like a weight on my chest. My footsteps echoed on the empty street as I made my way back to the car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just before I got into my car, I turned back one last time, out of curiosity maybe, or just a gut feeling I couldn't ignore. But when I looked back at the house, I swore I saw something shift in the dark, like a shadow moving just beyond the window. Something, or someone, was still there, watching. Around me feel unreal. The house loomed in front of me, dark and still, like it was holding its breath. I knocked softly at first, hoping for a normal interaction, a quick handoff, maybe a quick word, but no answer. My heart pounded a little harder. I knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Bellaroma's pizza delivery." Nothing, just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees, the rustling leaves, and the eerie quiet of the street. I stood there for a long moment, the darkness pressing in. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I turned to leave, annoyance mixing with growing anxiety. What the hell was going on? I started walking away, but the unease was like a weight on my chest. My footsteps echoed on the empty street as I made my way back to the car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just before I got into my car, I turned back one last time, out of curiosity maybe, or just a gut feeling I couldn't ignore. But when I looked back at the house, I swore I saw something shift in the dark, like a shadow moving just beyond the window. Something, or someone, was still there, watching. I had just taken a few steps toward my car when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, already on high alert. The man in the gray hoodie stood there, close enough that I could smell the stale cigarette smoke clinging to his breath. We locked eyes for a brief moment, and in that second, I could feel a chill crawl down my spine. His gaze was cold and calculating. Then he muttered, "You alone, right?" Before I could even respond, his hand shot out, and a small knife appeared in his grip. It wasn't huge, but it was sharp enough to do some serious damage. I froze, adrenaline rushing through my veins, turning my limbs to lead. My mind raced through every survival tip I'd ever heard. Hand him your wallet. Don't make sudden moves. Don't fight unless you have no choice. I forced myself to speak, try to keep my voice steady despite the panic that was starting to overtake me. "Look, man, take whatever you need. I don't want trouble." He didn't speak. He just gestured with a knife toward my pockets, his eyes flicking around nervously, like he was waiting for something. My hands were shaking as I reached for my wallet and phone, trying to stay calm. He snatched them from my hands, his fingers brushing mine in a cold, calculated movement. Then, without warning, the blade swung toward me in a quick arc. I jumped back, but I wasn't fast enough. The knife sliced across my palm, and the sharp sting of pain made my breath catch. Warm blood began to trickle down my wrist. I nearly dropped the pizza bag as a sudden wave of shock hit me. He stuffed my wallet and phone into the folds of his hoodie, eyes darting around again. It felt like a movie, my heart thundering in my chest, time slowing down, everything happening in a blur. "Don't follow me," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. Then, just like that, he bolted. He vanished into the darkness between the houses, moving quickly, like he had rehearsed this moment 100 times before. I just stood there, stunned, trying to process what had happened. The pain in my hand started to intensify, and that's when I realized I'm bleeding. I grabbed my car keys from the pizza bag, my hand trembling as I fumbled with them. I made my way back to my old Honda Civic, still shaken, and called 911 from the store's spare phone. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for help to arrive. The cops came shortly after, asking me questions, taking my statement and investigating the scene. When they checked the address, I learned that the house wasn't even inhabited. It had been abandoned for months. Apparently, the neighbors had seen someone sneaking in at night, but no one had ever gotten a good look at the person. The cut on my hand wasn't deep, but it needed a few stitches. It could have been worse. A lot worse. They never caught the guy, though, and I couldn't shake the feeling of violation that stayed with me long after the incident. I couldn't stop thinking, how'd he get my number? Was he calling in false orders just to lure me there? Had he been watching me the first time I delivered? The worst part? Not knowing if he'd tried this stunt on anyone else or if he would come after me again. For weeks, I couldn't shake the thought. I couldn't let it go. I'd spent years working hard to get where I was, but this whole experience felt like a punch to the gut. I kept telling myself to focus, to keep my head on straight. I needed to get back to my IT courses. I had to keep moving forward, hoping that someday I could leave pizza delivery behind for good. But every time I got into my car for another shift, a part of me wondered if I'd ever really escape the shadow of that night. Visiting our channel for the first time? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. I've always considered myself a pretty level-headed guy. I'm not the type to jump at shadows or work myself into a frenzy over every little noise. But a few months ago, I had an experience that completely changed how I feel about staying late at work or being alone, especially when it's late at night. I still think about it on quiet evenings, particularly when I'm the last person to leave the office. But that all changed when we took on a wave of new clients. The workload ramped up, and I started pulling long hours. Sometimes I'd stay past sunset, not leaving until 9 or 10 at night. I was the only one on our floor who didn't mind the silence. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it at first. No office chatter, no ringing phones, just me, my reports, and the steady hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was peaceful. I work a mid-sized accounting firm, tucked away in a nondescript office park just outside the city. It's the kind of place you drive by without giving a second glance. A plain building with flickering lights and a vast, poorly lit parking lot that always feels larger than it should. Most days, the place is quiet and unremarkable, with nothing to stir your thoughts. But that all changed when we took on a wave of new clients. The workload ramped up, and I started pulling long hours. Sometimes, I'd stay past sunset, not leaving until 9 or 10 at night. I was the only one on our floor who didn't mind the silence. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it at first. No office chatter, no ringing phones, just me, my reports, and the steady hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was peaceful. Then, one Friday in late October, things took a turn. I'd been working late all week, barely noticing how empty the office felt after 7 p.m. But that night, the silence seemed different. It was deeper, heavier somehow, as though the walls were closing around me. Around 8 p.m., I decided to step outside for a quick break. I was hoping the fresh air would wake me up a bit. When I stepped into the parking lot, I was struck by how deserted it felt. The sky had that dark, purple-gray tinge of an approaching storm, and the wind was picking up, rustling the leaves along the edge of the lot. I remember standing and went back inside, in by my car, stretching and just taking the cool air, trying to shake off the fatigue that had settled in my bones. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me. I turned around, expecting maybe a co-worker who'd forgotten something or was taking a break. But all I saw were rows of parked cars under flickering street lamps, the shadows stretching long across the asphalt. And then I saw it, a figure, standing near the far edge of the lot, just standing there, motionless. Could have been my imagination, I thought. The kind of low light where everything looks like it could be a person, a trick of the shadows. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a car's lights reflected in a weird way. I stretched one last time, and but a few days later, the routine remained the same. I stayed late, finishing up a client's report, trying not to doze off at my desk. It was 9 p.m. when my phone buzzed with a text from my wife, asking if I was on my way home yet. I figured I'd check the break room for some coffee, stretch my legs a little, and then head out. As I walked down the hallway toward the break room, I noticed the usual silence again, but this time it felt different, more oppressive, like the building was holding its breath. I glanced over the break room door, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow flicker near the corner of my eye. I paused, unsure if I'd imagined it. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced. It was probably just the tiredness getting to me, I told myself. But something about that flicker didn't sit right. I turned the corner, hoping to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. The office lights flickered, casting odd, dancing shadows along the walls. My heart skipped as I heard a soft noise behind me. Footsteps, or maybe just the sound of the building settling. But then, it came again, a faint whisper, like a voice on the edge of hearing. I froze. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was wrong. I wasn't alone. I had to turn around, but the hallway was still empty, just the hum of the lights. But as I looked down the hall toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there, just out of sight. I couldn't tell if it was just the building's weird acoustics or if there was someone lurking in the dark. I didn't take any chances. I quickly grabbed my coffee, trying to act normal, but the strange feeling followed me, like an invisible presence, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked back to my desk, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The eerie silence seemed to press down on me, and no matter how many times I tried to focus on my work, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling. The office lights were dim by the time I got to the break room. After 6 p.m., half the lights automatically switched off to save energy, leaving the building darker than usual. The quietness usually didn't bother me. But tonight it felt different. Every step I took echoed a little too loudly, like the walls were amplifying the solitude. When I entered the break room, something immediately felt off. The stale smell of cheap coffee hit me, and I noticed the pot was still on, brewing the last remnants of the day. That was strange. Nobody else was supposed to be here. The cleaning staff had already done their rounds, and the building was always empty after 6 p.m. I felt a twinge of unease but dismissed it, assuming maybe the cleaning crew had forgotten to turn it off. I poured out what was left, rinsed the pot, and left. But as I walked back down the hallway toward my desk, a cold sensation prickled at the back of my neck. I saw him then. At the far end of the corridor, standing in the shadows, was a man in a dark hoodie. He was leaning against the wall, perfectly still. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze for a moment, my mind racing. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. I considered calling out, asking if he needed something, but something stopped me. A cold instinct told me not to. I took a cautious step closer, my feet feeling heavy with each move. Maybe it was just a co-worker in casual clothes, someone who stayed late like I did. But the moment I moved, he disappeared around the corner, vanishing as if he'd been there 1 second and gone the next. I tried to rationalize it. The cleaning staff wore uniforms and none of them had hoodies. It couldn't have been one of them. Maybe it was a new guy, or perhaps a co-worker who came back for something. But why hide? Why be standing in the dark hallway that evening? I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I rushed to gather my things, suddenly feeling the weight of every second. I walked faster than usual, practically running to my car, eyes scanning the parking lot for any trace of him. I didn't see anything. The lot was empty, just like it had been when I pulled in. But after that night, things started to feel off. Little details I couldn't explain began to pile up. A door I could have sworn I locked would be slightly ajar when I returned. Footprints near my desk, as though someone had been standing there, watching me. One afternoon, my supervisor pulled me aside and asked if I knew why certain files in the archive room had been moved. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't have done it. I'd been busy working on my reports. Still, I brushed it off and told myself it was probably the cleaning crew or another co-worker who had been working late on a project. But even as I said it, the nagging doubt wouldn't leave my mind. Something wasn't right. One evening, after another long shift, I walked out of the building with the weight of a deadline looming over me. The parking lot was eerily quiet again, just like before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That sense of being watched. I forced myself to look around, scanning the lot, and there he was, standing at the edge of the lot, under one of the few working lamps, was the same hooded figure. I couldn't see his face, but his body was turned directly toward me. He was perfectly still, like he'd been waiting for me. I stared at him for a few seconds, hoping maybe he'd wave or give some indication that he was harmless. But he didn't move. He didn't acknowledge me at all. That was it. At that point, I decided I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I started leaving earlier, try to get out of the office before the night got too quiet. I even started asking a co-worker to stay late with me, just in case. But deadlines are deadlines, and eventually I found myself working alone again. And that night, that was when everything took a turn. I had to be alone again. That's when everything got worse. A week later, I was finishing up a project around 8:30 p.m. The office was quiet, as it always was late at night. Half the lights were on, casting dim shadows across the walls. The air felt thick with silence, and I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe that figure in the hallway was just a random stranger who slipped in. Maybe the guy in the parking lot was some bored teenager cutting through. I tried to drown out my growing anxiety by blasting loud music through my earbuds, hoping it would help me focus. But then it hit me, the unmistakable feeling that someone was standing behind me. I spun around in my chair, ripping the earbuds out of my ears. But when I looked, no one was there. My office door was open, as it always was. But the hallway beyond was dark, empty, except I noticed something strange. A piece of paper was taped to the outside of the door frame. My pulse spiked, my heart hammering in my chest as I walked toward it slowly. The piece of paper was a scrap of printer paper with the word hello scrawled across it in thick black marker. No signature, no explanation, just that one word. A chill ran through me. I yanked the paper down and tossed it into the trash, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Who would do that? And why such a creepy, random message? That was it for me. I shut down my computer and hurried out of the office. As I made my way to the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It felt like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. When I finally got into my car and locked the doors, I just sat there for a moment, tried to calm myself. But then I looked up. In the rear view mirror, I saw him. The hoodie guy was standing on the curb, about 30 feet behind my car. The red glow of my brake lights illuminated him, his face still hidden by the shadow of his hood. He wasn't moving toward me, just standing there, watching. A cold wave of alarm rushed through my gut. My hand shook as I backed out of the parking lot, my foot pressing the pedal faster than I meant to. I didn't dare look back, but I felt his gaze follow me as I sped away. For a while, nothing happened. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whoever he was had lost interest or moved on. But a couple of weeks later, everything took another dark turn. It was late again. I had stopped by a convenience store on my way home, my mind running on autopilot after a long day of work. I grabbed some coffee and snacks and was heading back to my car when I noticed him again. There he was, leaning against the side of the building. Hoodie pulled low over his face, hidden in the shadows. The same posture, the same unnerving stillness. My heart skipped a beat and panic crept up my spine. I hurried to my car, fumbled with my keys, feeling the pressure time pushing down on me. My breath quickened, but by the time I got the door open and turned around, he was gone. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the empty parking lot, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he following me outside of work now? Had he been watching me even when I was in the office? The thought made my skin crawl, and I drove home feeling uneasy, my head pounding with the unknown. A few nights later, I was back at the office again. It had been a long week, and I was determined to finish up early. Around 7 p.m., I got a phone call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but this time, something made me hesitate. I picked up the phone out of habit. Silence greeted me from the other end. I listened hard, straining to hear something, anything. All I could make out was a faint crackling static. My pulse quickened, a chill creeping down my spine. "Hello," I said, my voice tight with growing unease. I repeated it a couple of times, my anxiety starting to rise with each unanswered second. Finally, the call disconnected without a word. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just a bad connection or maybe a wrong number. But something in my gut told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. The man. The same feeling I'd gotten from that strange piece of paper. Just a simple hello scrawled in black marker. Now, I could almost hear his breathing through the phone, the faintest sound, letting me know he could reach me at any time. It was as if he was saying, "I know where you are. I know who you are." That was the final straw. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. The sense of dread gnawing at me was real. I went straight to my supervisor the next day and told him I refused to stay late alone anymore. I didn't even bother to make up an excuse. Since then, I've stuck to a strict schedule, making sure I'm never alone after hours. I started leaving with everyone else. The strangest part of all this? Nobody else in the office has mentioned seeing a stranger. It's like he singled me out for reasons I still can't explain. My name is Jonathan Parker. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I work as a systems analyst for a marketing firm downtown. I'm also a single parent to my 6-year-old daughter, Nibbles. My work schedule had always been hectic, but recently, my boss allowed me to work the late night shift from home. It's a godsend since it helps me care for Nibbles in the evenings. But it also means I stay awake into the early hours, huddled over my laptop in the quiet of the night. On the night of May 4th, 2023, I was finishing a project that was due the next morning. The overhead light in my bedroom was dim, and a small lamp on my desk provided most of the illumination from my workspace. Nubbles had fallen asleep around 8:30 p.m. and was quietly resting in her small bed next to my desk. It was close to 11 p.m. when I first heard it, the sharp, insistent knocks at the front door. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor, maybe someone with a question or perhaps a late delivery. It was an unusual hour for either, but still, I didn't think too much of it. But then the knocking grew louder, more urgent, as if someone was desperate to get inside. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The noise seemed to grow more forceful with each passing second. Naturally, I felt a twinge of concern for Nubbles, who remained fast asleep despite the disturbance. I turned on my phone's doorbell camera app to see who was at the door. The small screen flickered to life, revealing a young woman, maybe in her late teens, standing on my porch. She was shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder as though she was being watched. Something in her expression made my heart skip a beat. She looked terrified. I used the camera's speaker to ask if she was all right. Her voice came back in a frantic whisper. "Please," she said, almost breathless. "Someone's been following me for several blocks. I'm scared for my life. Can you help me?" My protective instincts kicked in immediately, a wave of concern rushing over me. I could tell she was in distress. And though I was instinctively cautious about letting strangers into my home, something about her situation felt urgent. But before I could respond, she looked over her. Simple act of kindness to help a stranger in distress turned into a terrifying night that would haunt me forever. One mistake, and I opened the door to a carefully planned crime. Shoulder again, her face pale and filled with dread. I could see her hands trembling in the dim light of the porch. My heart raced as I debated what to do next. Should I open the door and let her in? Was she telling the truth, or was there something I was missing? The last thing I wanted was to put Nubbles in danger. Instincts took over. I raced downstairs. My mind raced with the thought that the girl might be in genuine danger. I reached the door and peeked through the peephole, but there was no one else in sight. Just her, standing alone on the porch. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door a few inches, and she practically stumbled inside, as if her legs couldn't carry her anymore. Her face was pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps, like she had been running for miles. My heart tightened in my chest, but I focused on getting her inside and locking the door behind us. I didn't want to wake Nubbles, so I kept the noise to a minimum, guiding the girl to the living room. I offered her some water, but she didn't take it. Her eyes kept flicking toward the door, scanning the darkness outside, as if she were expecting someone. Her body was trembling, and she seemed unable to calm herself. Before I could ask her for more details, a sudden, powerful pounding rattled the front door. My heart jumped in my chest. I felt a wave of panic surge as the door shook from the force of the knocks. I grabbed my phone again, switching to the doorbell camera, and my stomach sank when I saw who was on the other side. 3 men stood there, all wearing dark hooded jackets, their faces hidden in shadow. One of them stepped forward and, in a gruff voice, demanded that I open the door, insisting they simply needed directions. I could feel the girl behind me quaking, her fear palpable as she whispered urgently, "They're the ones who followed me. Don't let them in." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything about the situation felt wrong. I tried to remain calm, even as my pulse hammered in my throat. I spoke into the doorbell speaker, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to leave. If you don't, I'm calling the police." But instead of retreating, the men grew more aggressive. They pounded harder on the door, demanding to be let inside. I could feel my pulse quickening, my thoughts spiraling, but just as I was about to act, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head. The world blurred. My vision wavered, and I heard the sickening sound of my phone hitting the floor. The camera feed spun as it fell, the last image I saw before everything went black. I collapsed in a daze, the shock of the blow more prominent than the pain at first. Confusion clouded my thoughts. The last thing I remembered was the front door creaking open. When I regained consciousness, the room was eerily silent. My head throbbed painfully, and I groggily pushed myself upright. The living room was in disarray. Cushions were tossed about, drawers were pulled out, and belongings were scattered all over the floor. The front door stood ajar, letting in the cool night air. A sense of dread washed over me. I could barely focus, my vision swimming as I stumbled toward the stairs. My forehead felt hot with pain, but my first thought wasn't for myself. It was for Nubbles. My legs were shaky as I made my way upstairs, tripping over discarded objects on the steps. By some miracle, when I reached her room, she was still asleep, undisturbed by the chaos downstairs. I gently shook her awake, my heart racing with fear. I checked her over quickly, relieved to find she was unharmed. She was only startled by the mess of my frantic expression, but she was safe. The weight on my chest lightened for a moment, but the reality of what had just happened hit me hard. I immediately called the police, explaining that someone had broken into my home. My hands were shaking as I gave them the details, trying to stay composed, but I knew things were far from over. Officers arrived within minutes, their patrol lights flashing across my living room walls, casting erratic shadows on the disarray that had once been my home. They moved quickly, sweeping through every room of the house, checking for any sign of the intruders. But it was clear the criminals and the girl were long gone. After conducting a preliminary investigation, the officers confirmed what I already feared. Several valuables were missing. My laptop, Nubbles' tablet, and various small electronics had been taken. The intruders had also rifled through my desk drawers, likely searching for documents or money. One of the investigators took my statement, his expression growing more serious as I described a young woman who had first appeared at my door. When I mentioned her frantic whispers and how she seemed genuinely terrified, I noticed an officer exchange a knowing glance with his partner. "Sir," one of them said carefully, "this is a ploy that's been reported several times in the area." They went on to explain that the scam had become disturbingly common. A seemingly vulnerable individual would beg for help, gain access to the home, and then work with accomplices to rob the unsuspecting homeowner. In many cases, homeowners were assaulted, though fortunately, the injuries weren't usually severe. The officers assured me they would do everything in their power to track down the suspects. They told me that the group had already targeted several homes throughout Cleveland, but none of the victims had been able to provide a clear description of where the thieves disappeared afterward. They seemed just as frustrated as I was, but their words did little to comfort me. Days passed without any updates. The gang's whereabouts remained a mystery, and the girl's identity was still unknown. Each time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat, hoping the police had tracked them down, but each call was a dead end. They never found her. They never found any of them. In the end, I was left with a haunting realization. My decision to help a stranger in distress had, quite literally, opened the door to a well-orchestrated crime. My daughter was safe, thank God, but the sense of violation, of being taken advantage of, lingered in my mind. It gnawed at me, making it impossible to shake the nagging question. Had I delayed my decision to open the door or inspected the situation further, would they have been able to get in so easily? The thought keeps me awake at night, a constant reminder that sometimes trying to do the right thing can have consequences we never see coming.